On a Prayer, Faith is Awaken by Elton Thomas, Episode 16, Walls of Corruption. Dusty sat in a cramped office, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead buzzing like an irritating mosquito he couldn't quite swat away. The walls were lined with dull beige filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. A thick layer of dust coated the tops of each cabinet, and the stale scent of mildew lingered in the air, mingling with the unmistakable odor of burnt coffee. Across the desk from him sat a man who could have easily been mistaken for part of the furniture. He had a doughy face, deep-set eyes, and a tie that had seen better days. His thinning hair was slicked back in an attempt to hide the bald spots, and his shirt strained over a belly that indicated more desk-sitting than anything else. His name was Dean Riley, and Dusty had been trying to pry information from him for the better part of an hour. "I've told you everything I know," Riley said, his voice a bored monotone. He scratched at the corner of his eye as if Dusty's questions were little more than a mild annoyance. "It's all tied up in paperwork, man. There's nothing I can do. This case is above my pay grade." Dusty clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into tight fists beneath the desk. He could feel his patience fraying, the edges of his resolve scraping against the bureaucracy that had been slowing him down since he started this investigation. Riley represented everything wrong with the system: indifference, laziness, and a willingness to look the other way when the stakes were life and death. Mila's life was hanging in the balance, and all Dusty was getting were roadblocks. "You don't get it," Dusty said, his voice low and dangerous. "There's a little girl out there. Her name is Mila, and she doesn't have time for your paperwork. Jackson Brown is holding her somewhere, and every second you sit here doing nothing is another second closer to her disappearing for good." Riley sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair as if Dusty's urgency was nothing more than an inconvenience. He glanced at the stack of papers on his desk, shrugging. "I'm telling you, it's out of my hands. You need higher clearance. And even if I could help you, you're stepping on toes with this one. Jackson's got friends in high places." Dusty's eyes narrowed, the anger simmering beneath his calm facade threatening to boil over. He had seen this before: corruption that ran deep, greasing the wheels of the system, protecting men like Jackson who thrived in the shadows. It was infuriating, knowing that even the institutions meant to protect people like Mila were just as tangled in the web of lies and deceit as the criminals they were supposed to stop. Dusty stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a harsh screech. Riley barely flinched, his eyes flicking up to meet Dusty's with a mixture of boredom and faint amusement. It was clear he didn't take Dusty seriously, didn't understand the gravity of what was at stake. "I'll find her without your help," Dusty said, his voice cold and hard. "But when I do, and when Jackson's empire crumbles, you'll wish you hadn't been sitting on your hands." Riley didn't respond, simply offering a non-committal grunt as Dusty turned and stormed out of the office. The heavy door slammed behind him, the echo reverberating through the narrow hallway. Dusty's chest heaved with barely controlled anger, but he knew he couldn't afford to lose focus. Mila's life depended on him staying sharp, staying in control. As Dusty made his way out of the building, he pulled his phone from his pocket, his mind racing. He had exhausted every official channel. No one was willing to lift a finger, and every lead seemed to evaporate as soon as he followed it. But he wasn't about to give up. He couldn't. There was too much at stake. Just as he reached the door, his phone buzzed in his hand. A text message. Dusty glanced down at the screen. "Got a tip. Mila might be at a place called Paradise Massage. Be careful." Dusty's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the number. It belonged to one of Jackson's lower-level guys, someone who had given Dusty scraps of information before, but always with caution. If this tip was real, if Mila was at that massage parlor, it could be the break he'd been waiting for. But the warning lingered in his mind. Be careful. Dusty stepped out into the cold night air, the city's sounds washing over him, the distant rumble of traffic, the occasional shout from a passerby, the blare of sirens somewhere far off. The sky above was clouded, casting a gray, oppressive pall over the streets. He pulled his jacket tighter against the wind and started walking toward his car, his mind already working through the possibilities. He knew this could be a setup. Jackson had eyes everywhere, and Dusty had been getting closer to unraveling his network. An ambush wouldn't be out of the question. But Dusty couldn't afford to ignore the tip. If there was even a chance that Mila was at that massage parlor, he had to act. As Dusty drove through the city, the streetlights flickered by in a blur, his thoughts racing as fast as the car beneath him. He could feel the weight of the gun at his hip, the tension coiling tighter with every mile. His heart pounded in his chest, his pulse a steady drumbeat that matched the urgency of the situation. Paradise Massage was in one of the seedier parts of town, a place where people went to disappear, to do things in the dark that no one talked about in the light. Dusty pulled up to the building, the neon sign flickering above the door, casting a sickly glow over the rain-slicked pavement. The windows were dark, the blinds pulled tight, but there were a few cars parked out front. Dusty's instincts screamed at him to be cautious. He stepped out of the car, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning the area for anything out of place. The street was quiet, too quiet, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something wasn't right. He approached the door, his hand resting on the gun at his side, ready for anything. The door creaked open as he pushed it, and the faint smell of cheap perfume and sweat hit him like a wave. The inside of the massage parlor was dimly lit, the soft glow of red lamps casting eerie shadows across the room. Dusty's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the low light. The front desk was empty, but he could hear muffled voices coming from the back rooms, barely audible over the soft thrum of music playing through hidden speakers. He moved silently, his footsteps careful, his senses on high alert. As he reached the hallway, the voices grew louder, men talking, laughing, unaware that Dusty was closing in. He slipped his gun from its holster, the weight of it familiar and comforting in his hand. But just as he rounded the corner, a loud bang shattered the air. Dusty's reflexes kicked in, his body moving on instinct as he threw himself against the wall, barely dodging the first bullet that whizzed past him. His pulse quickened, adrenaline surging through his veins. He was in the middle of an ambush, just as he had feared. A second shot rang out, this one grazing his shoulder, but Dusty barely flinched. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay focused, to push through the pain. His mind raced as he assessed the situation. There were at least 3 men in the room ahead, their voices now filled with panic as they realized their prey wasn't going down easily. Dusty's grip tightened on the gun, his breaths coming in short, controlled bursts. His body seemed to move on its own, faster than his thoughts could process. He pivoted from his cover, firing off 2 quick shots that found their marks, disarming one of the men and wounding another. But there was no time to revel in the small victory. The last man lunged at him, a flash of steel catching Dusty's eye as the man swung a knife at his chest. Dusty's movements were fluid, almost impossibly fast. He sidestepped the attack, his body reacting with a speed and precision that even he didn't fully understand. He brought the butt of his gun down hard on the man's wrist, knocking the knife loose before delivering a swift kick that sent the attacker sprawling to the ground. Dusty stood there, his chest heaving as the last of the men lay unconscious or writhing in pain. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. His movements had been beyond natural, almost superhuman. For a moment, Dusty just stood there, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear or exertion, but from the realization that something beyond him had just taken control. The prayers of Pastor Ethan, Roxy, and others floated through his mind like echoes, and for the first time, Dusty couldn't ignore the feeling that something greater was at work. He swallowed hard, shaking off the strange sensation as he moved quickly through the rest of the building, his eyes scanning every corner for Mila. But the massage parlor was empty, no sign of the girl anywhere. His jaw clenched in frustration as he holstered his gun, the pain in his shoulder flaring again. This had been a setup, a way to slow him down, to distract him. But as Dusty stepped back into the cold night air, the realization settled over him like a heavy weight. He had survived, and not just because of his training, his instincts, or his gun. Something else had been guiding him, moving him in ways he couldn't explain. But there was no time to question it now. Mila was still out there, and Dusty knew that he was closer than ever to finding her. Even if he didn't fully understand the power that had been protecting him, he couldn't deny that it was there. And tonight, it had saved his life.